Good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to have you with us today. My name's Jill Tipping. I'm the CEO of BC Tech, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to a very special edition of the popular podcast, Political Capital. I will hand over to Rob and our panelists, who will introduce themselves and get ourselves kicked off. Over to you, Rob.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here today. I know that BC politics is a little wild and wacky, and everyone is trying to get their heads around it right now. So we're probably going to start by giving you an overview of where everything is, because it's changing by the moment. The word we're using is fluid. And so we're going to start with that, and we're going to move on. But for those who haven't listened to the podcast before, my name is Rob Shaw. I've been covering politics now for 16 years at the legislature. For places like the Vancouver Sun. I'm now with Czech News, but I also write for Business in Vancouver and some of the Glacier publications, and I'm on CBC, and we do the show, and there's lots of different hats that I'm wearing. And a few years ago when I came to Czech, I thought we need to do a podcast show about BC politics that doesn't suck, because so many political panels out there have spokespeople from parties, and they just waste your time saying nonsense that you're not going to believe as soon as you hear it. And that's the opposite of what we have tried to do with this panel. So we have got three great people who have worked inside the parties, building the parties, organizing, volunteering, campaigning, working in government, working in opposition, working in leadership races, actual folks who are on the ground who know what they are doing. You'll see their biographies in the sheet that was on your seats there, and I'll introduce them in a second. We are not here to just read party lines to you. We're here to talk about what's actually happening behind the scenes, why it's happening, how government works, how the parties work, where they stand, what you need to know about the political landscape in a wild time right now. So with that, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we're going to start to detangle the web of BC politics for you, keeping in mind that the last 2 weeks, everything's just blown up, and the election begins not this Saturday, next Saturday, so we could have major developments since then, but it'll be current as of today anyway. So I'll introduce Jillian Oliver, who you'll see in your biography there, but Jillian worked for the BC Greens. She led Sonia Furstenau's leadership campaign. She has worked in the election campaigns for the Greens. She's been part of the Greens since the beginning. Jillian and I, with Andrew Weaver, during the CASA agreement, that power-sharing agreement between the Greens and the NDPs after 2017, Jillian was there for all of that and has great insight into the Greens. Jeff Ferrier has his own company now, FramePoint, but he has worked inside the...
It's a partnership. There's some of us.
It's all yours.
Not all me.
He's worked inside government in the Ministry of Health during COVID as an executive director. He's also volunteered for the NDP, not just here, but in other provinces, and he'll talk a little bit about that. He's seen all aspects of that party over many, many years in many forms. And Allie Blades is one of the best campaign strategists in the entire province, bar none, co-directing Pierre Poilievre's BC component of his leadership campaign for the federal Conservatives, working in all sorts of permutations of what was BC Liberal into BC United, now into the BC Conservative Party, and an excellent source of insight into all of that, and really on the cutting edge of a lot of the campaign, marketing, promotions, messaging kind of material that you will be consuming, whether you like it or not, out there during this election. So we're going to start with you, Allie. Just sketch out for us right now and for the audience, maybe for folks who haven't been following politics, or they've seen a couple headlines about the implosion of BC United. They don't even know what United is. It might sound like a soccer team to them. Like, what is the landscape of BC politics right now, and how has it changed over just the last couple of weeks?
An implosion indeed. Let me start by going way back to when Kevin Falcon won the leadership for the BC Liberals. And I think that's important because the name change was a campaign promise of his from his leadership campaign. And so as a decent politician, he kept true to his word in changing the name afterwards. And then I was actually on the team that was responsible for the name change and the new branding. So we created the new branding. Side note, it's supposed to be the teal as a nod to their federal Conservative coalition, and then the pink as a nod to the federal Liberals because, of course, they were a coalition of both federally. Now, then we launched this new BC United name and brand, and it failed. And why did it fail? Because we can't just do a new brand. You have to say what you stand for. What are your new policies? What's the new team look like? Christy Clark did a really good job of always saying, well, we're a free enterprise coalition. No one ever actually knew what free enterprise meant, but it sounded nice and she marketed it well. Kevin Falcon failed to do that. And then on top of that, it was a very limited budget that they used to promote the new name and to promote like the new vision. And they did it a little bit too late. There was this $1 million campaign ad that they did with Kevin's face on Global, and they were very well produced ads. But then again, what do they stand for? What are they going to do? Where do they stand on the political spectrum as well? Are they center right? Are they leaning more towards the right? But are they only solely after the centrist votes? That was a little confusing to people as well. Fast forward, polling, not so great, mostly because people don't understand what they stand for. But then the Conservatives, they picked up that space because, well, the blue wave federal momentum was really picking up, and so therefore, like, they were able to take advantage of that quite well with a lot of overlap in messaging, i.e. Pierre Poilievre would say something, and then John Rustad would say the exact same thing. It's not rocket science. And then the polls weren't so great, and so then Kevin came out and said, I'm going to suspend the campaign so that there's not this vote split, which, for better or for worse, it is what he did, and so that meant that a lot of his MLA candidates didn't necessarily make draft 2024 to move over to the Conservatives. And now we're in this space of we have no idea what's going to happen to the BC United. We have no idea what Kevin's political future is, other than it's probably going to end after October 19th, and you'll see him in the private sector again. But there's a whole conversation that I think we're going to get into a little bit later of, well, where does that centrist vote go? Not everybody from the BC United, formerly the BC Liberals, are automatically going to the Conservatives. So there's a lot to say about that. But it was very messy, and it's not quite done yet.
Mm-hmm. And it means what was a four-party political system in BC, the Greens, the NDP, United, and the Conservatives, now down to three. And the gulf between the NDP and the Conservatives is very similar to the gulf that you see in some other provinces, or even, dare I say, in some other countries where you end up with this kind of extreme two-party system. And then the Greens are looking to continue kind of their sort of third-party viability, and so...
Yeah, I was just going to say that the failure of BC United is less to do with its branding and marketing, and more that Kevin Falcon wasn't selling a product that made sense in a fluid. Is that the word we're using? I don't like that word.
You can use fluid. You can also use moistly, but that's...
No. In a fluid political environment where you're seeing more polarization. It's not just in British Columbia, but it's all over North America, all around the world. And he was trying to be all things to all folks, and folks were just confused, and we don't understand what he stands for, but we sure do know what these Conservatives stand for, and it's like what they're talking about in the States, and it's like what they're talking about in Europe, and it's like what Pierre Poilievre is talking about, and I'm hearing that makes sense to me. So for me, it was a product launch failure more than a marketing failure.
Mm-hmm. Jillian,
I'll add one more thing to that, just going off of what you're saying, Jeff, that Kevin Falcon, given that he was part of government before, given that he's a long-time politician, he came back thinking that this was 2009. So he was campaigning for that time period of what the membership makeup was in 2009. He didn't really adjust coming back, and I think that ultimately was the failure. I like to call him like a Vancouver Club politician, where it's this kind of bubble of people. And
you're saying that because we're in the Terminal City Club here.
As a member, we are the better one.
Okay,
but he was campaigning for a very different time and really didn't adjust. And we saw kind of glimpses of that during leadership, where it was basically a time machine of him going back.
Mm-hmm. Jillian, the last time people got really interested in politics, I remember 2017. Suddenly, the entire population was faced with this tie election. and ordinary folks on the street were talking about who's going to be Speaker of the Legislature, a position no one even knows what it does. The guy has a funny triangle hat, and like suddenly the population was seized by it. How different is the dynamic now from 2017? What has changed since the last election? Because we had a 2020 election in COVID. It wasn't really a real election. There was a lot of fear. It was a different time. So we're all looking back at 2017 and kind of trying to see how we have changed since we got to where we are now.
Well, I think, the biggest thing as it relates to Kevin Falcon is I think the change in the campaign finance rules, and I think that's another thing that kind of was his undoing, is that he didn't adjust to the new situation where now we have limits on how much parties can raise from anybody. They can't raise from the private sector, and I think that he sort of failed to adjust to that new dynamic and the way that sort of shifted political power. I think that in terms of the political dynamics, there was so much exhaustion in 2017 that the Liberals were up against that sort of, in retrospect, made the outcome of the Greens working with the NDP probably inevitable, whereas I think in this election, the NDP are much more popular and there's less anger towards them going into the campaign. Still, when you look at the polling, even though vote intention is close between the Conservatives and the NDP is still seen as the better party to deal with most of the big issues, even though people are unsatisfied with them. So some similarities in terms of the sort of two big parties and then the Greens potentially occupying the space. And then also the other thing we didn't mention is a bunch of independents running, former BC United members that didn't make the leap over to the Conservatives that could also play kingmaker potentially. That's another interesting dynamic. But yeah, definitely starting to look more like 2017 than we thought it would a couple months ago.
It could be queenmakers too if Sonia
True.
has a big surge in the campaign.
Yeah, the polling showing right now, if you believe in polling, which,
Rob doesn't believe in polling.
I don't, but it's all we have a lot of the time. If you believe in polling, we're in a tie position right now in the voters' minds between the BC NDP and the BC Conservatives. And so we end up back, as Jillian's talking about, in that 2017 dynamic, as if we are in a tie and we have a weird political system of first past the post where the popular vote tie doesn't necessarily mean 93 ridings are going to be divided up in half. There's individual fights that comprise our system. But if we do end up in that, we have the possibility that independents, some folks who were used to be BC United, who had their nominations yanked away when the party collapsed, are going to run. Maybe they win some seats. Maybe the Greens are winning some seats. Maybe the balance of power is held by a smaller group of people. That's one of the dynamics that we're watching right now as we try to sketch out the system and what it might look like, and then how that influences who makes decisions in the future. I want to go just talk about something that came up yesterday, and you may have seen some headlines on it, but we're dealing now with the discussion of whether BC has entered the American-style culture wars in this election. It's something Premier David Eby mentioned yesterday. We started talking out of nowhere about abortion in British Columbia, which is a topic that in the United States is obviously a big topic. In BC, we haven't talked about this since like the 1970s. But the Conservatives, the BC Conservatives, have varying social positions, varying candidates. The NDP are pushing hard on social issues, and suddenly we have an election where we are talking about reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, all sorts of issues that we haven't talked about before. And Allie, do we think that's going to carry through the election with the dynamic that we have right now? And are we going to be talking about social issues in an American-style way, or is that just some of the rhetoric that the politicians are putting out?
The answer is yes. I think we are going to talk about these divisive issues because it is a tactic and a strategy from the NDP. In order for them to make sure that the spotlight's not on them, they're going to create an issue, and this is one of those big ones where they know that on the BC Conservative side, there's not really a true answer on SOGI or on abortion issues. And they're utilizing that in order to catch John Rustad in a moment of being off message. Now, in my ever unsolicited advice to anyone who will hear me, what John Rustad needs to do is that he has made various comments over the last few months as the spotlight's on him as leader that are all over the place. So he hasn't really answered the question on SOGI. He needs to do that. Or the NDP will define it for him, and watch, there will be an ad on this soon coming to your Meta on what does John Rustad really believe, and he's taking away women's rights. And well, that very well could be true, but it's more of a branding him in this light versus what he actually personally believes. Then, on top of that, it's not just all about the leader. You have all of these individual candidates that can't stay on message because they're brand new. The Conservatives have done a really good job of identifying candidates that are not people who were 5 years old and decided that they were going to become the prime minister. They are actual real people. Therefore, real people say what they believe. And they are new to this brand messaging. So what they need to do is figure out the answer, and then they need to share that with the rest of their caucus, their team, so that everybody's on the same page. Interestingly enough, though, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, where this is also happening in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is also having a provincial election, and the opposition has successfully made parental rights and pronouns for underage for kids one of their top issues. And so I think that's what also the NDP are trying to do right now.
Jeff, you're biting at the bit there.
Champing at the bit
Champing.
is the word. I think some of this is the function of a party that until a few months ago had 2 MLAs being thrust in the position where they are now on the doorsteps of potentially forming a government. And the scale up that needs to happen and the challenges that they're facing meeting the pressures that are on them now. The days of each of the main parties in the campaign having a detailed policy book with promises on every single issue, including the tech industry. BC Conservatives are lucky if they're going to have a housing policy before the election happens. They will, but they're not going to get down to that granular detail. So that creates an opening for the other party to create a little bit of chaos and trouble by saying, well, what's your plan on this? What's your plan on that? And they don't have the answer. And then you get into these discussions. I will say, though, that on the candidate search side, one of the reasons why the NDP is probably doing what it's doing is that a number of the Conservative candidates believe some weird things. And this is a tech crowd. Maybe you can help me out. Does 5G spread COVID?
You need to offer the backstory of that.
Because there was a candidate in Prince George who was the chair of the school board who thought that 5G was an agent of a genocidal weapon that was responsible for spreading COVID-19. And when you're a party with 2 MLAs and like 3 staff, you're not going to be able to go through everyone's Facebook and Twitter and see what's going on. But that's going to be an ongoing dynamic in the campaign of unanswered questions because they don't have all of the policy set, and the candidate vetting was tough for them. And some people said one guy said COVID vaccines turned you into a magnet. Yeah. Yeah, you go through the airport security and it would beep. Don't go to a shooting range if you've had your vaccine because the bullet's going to turn around because you're a magnet.
So, but the point being that when you're seeing these ads and you're seeing the discussion around this, there's an effort, Jillian, to try and brand a John Rustad because the public's not familiar with him. The parties come out of nowhere. The candidates, some of them have weird ideas, and some of them have extreme social views on social issues. And the opponents are trying to brand him with that. And that's why you're going to see the ads pop up in your social media feed and on the news because of that dynamic, right?
Yeah, well, when you're an incumbent government, you want to make the implication that switching is risky, and that's exactly the line that you're seeing from the NDP in their ads. Is it's a risk we can't afford, and if there's any kind of uncertainty about who the other party is, voters will often choose the sort of safer option. One of the most famous ones is George W. Bush said in his debate when he was in between terms, "You don't change horses in the middle of the stream." Even though he was, underwater, really unpopular because of the Afghanistan war and things like that, he still got reelected because people, especially in times of uncertainty right now, where there's a lot of bad feelings about the way things are, people will tend to vote for incumbent governments if they're just seen as less of a risk. So I think that's sort of like what you're seeing the dynamic develop there. And like Jeff was saying, I think the Conservatives have been in a position where they've been sort of making things up as they go along. Russ Dad was actually kicked out by Kevin Falcon for tweeting about kind of climate denial views, saying that carbon dioxide doesn't cause climate change. So he kind of had a bone to pick, then went on and joined the Conservatives and got the opportunity to talk in question period where they can ask questions to the government. And those early days when him and another colleague who joined him were really they went with the U.S. culture war stuff right away, talking about banning books that are in high school, talking about the SOGI stuff, which is the anti-bullying legislation that the Liberals had brought in. And so kind of using that as a tactic early on to get traction, get attention, kind of, raise temperatures in the legislature before even conceiving of the position that they'd be in right now, where they have to appeal to more moderate voters to actually have a shot at forming government. So because they've had sort of a scattershot approach in the last couple of months, there's a lot of openings for the NDP and the Greens also to sort of pick at their weaknesses there.
But you know what I hear from folks on the... This is the line that we always use in politics. You know what I hear from folks on the door? I've been helping with the candidate. People are really focused on, can I please see a family doctor? Can I please afford a house? Can someone please help me pay my bills because it's hard? If you're a business, it's about, can you please make it easier for me to attract people here by having homes that they can afford, and they'll come here because there's health care for their family. So there's all this stuff going on, but there's also this sense of frustration amongst a lot of voters. It's like, could you just please start talking about the stuff that matters to our day-to-day life?
And those issues, it's interesting because David Eby's been in office now for 20 months. He took over from John Horgan when John Horgan retired due to cancer. And David Eby was faced with a question very early on whether he was going to call a snap election. And he did not. He had what was really kind of an incredible agenda that he brought out and tabled for his premiership, full of housing changes and all sorts of changes. And he promised at the time, 20 months ago, to show visible results before the election. And that's one of the things that we are charting in the media and pundits are charting as well, is on those major issues that Jeff just raised, housing and childcare and affordability, has he shown visible results? Street disorder, the downtown east side, addictions. That was the promise. Should he have gone to an early election? We disagree on that, but he's where he is now, 20 months into his ambitious agenda with a promise for visible change on major issues. Can he show it to voters? Do voters expect to see a result on big issues like that? And it seems like it's a kind of fundamental part of the campaign, Allie, that is like, Jillian, that is he's wrestling with, in some ways, can you change the housing system fundamentally in 20 months and show people that they can buy more affordable housing when it's really interest rates that are doing that? Can you change healthcare in 20 months? How do you follow through on your big promises of becoming premier when you only had less than half a term to do it?
Yeah, it was definitely an ambitious claim to make. I think that he really believed it at the time. And I think that it's maybe less that he needs to say, I fixed these issues, then we're on the right track, and have that be believable. I live in Nelson in the interior, and things are, we have a housing crisis there, but things are pretty good. Coming here, what did strike me is just how much stuff is underway compared to, we're kind of just sitting behind the screen talking about this stuff week after week. Things can feel pretty bad, but I look around and there's, schools being built and things are happening, and that's what you see them right now. They're kind of, showing up at every construction site that they can to do an announcement. Okay, stop the panel right here. We're good. We're good. I'm the NDP guy. That's great. I probably would have answered differently last week before I came here and started to see, I think that there are things in motion, and sort of just talking to people over the last week, I think that there is something that they can pick up on there to convince people that they're on the right track. Versus the risk of getting off track. And that's the other argument that you see them making with Rustad, is that he's from the BC Liberal government. Remember how bad it was. They're the ones that created the housing crisis, all these other things. Trying to contrast those records and hope that people's memory is at least that long. Yeah.
We'll touch on the economy in a second here, but does anyone else want to jump in on the EB?
Sure. First of all, I'm really it's interesting to be in a room full of people, because usually I'm shielded from people's anger at government by the computer screen.
The keyboard warrior.
Now I've heard that the first comment's like 2/3 of the people don't like what your government is doing. I'm like, okay, great. This is going to be a good audience. I hope we keep the lunch until later, so there's no buns to throw at me. Christy Clark. I'm going to quote Christy Clark. Can you believe this? In a positive way. She said, governments don't run against the almighty, they run against the alternatives. And I think in this case, it's going to be a close election. The election's going to matter. There's a lot of anger and upsettedness out there about the direction of the province, particularly on those issues that I talked about. But it is going to be fundamentally are we on the right track, or do we risk going down rabbit holes with a new party that's very new, that doesn't have a plan and isn't ready to govern? And I think that's how it will shake, and that's what most folks will think about, who are at least in the middle or are uncertain who they're going to vote for. EP will talk about 831 new family doctors. He'll talk about all the changes he's made to incent housing. He'll talk about taking tolls off bridges and MSP premiums and all sorts of rebates. And Restab will talk about the carbon tax that's taxing everyone into poverty, and you don't see and feel the housing, and it'll be an interesting debate. The one area where I think the government needs to do better, and we're certainly feeling this in Vancouver, is around the issue of public safety and mental health and the opioid overdose issues. I think there was a really troubling incident that happened downtown in Vancouver that's kind of been a flashpoint around someone just not too far from here being killed in a random act of violence, and another person being badly injured. And I think that's kind of a sleeper issue, that issue of public safety and overdose crisis, that unless government is careful, could tip the balance to the other side.
And we are expecting later this week Premier Eby to announce some version of involuntary care for those with severe addictions on the street. It was an idea that he had when he was running for leader. People who repeatedly overdose, who are suffering mental health crises, should be taken and treated until they are able to make decisions about their health in a better way. He backed off as soon as he became premier. Now he's coming back to it, partly because the issue has become such a political problem for him, but also that he believes that the government should be doing something there. So you'll see that later this week as an attempt to influence the dynamic of street disorder as a political issue that the NDP are struggling with, and also to address some of the random violence, some of the feeling the public gets when they're walking down the street and someone's in distress and you're just walking over them. And what kind of world is that?
Your tech business in Gastown, and you're wanting your workers to feel safe going to work. It's not a particularly good time for that. And so I hope that we do see what you're saying, and I hope that it works.
Allie, you want to jump in?
I talk to a lot of more conservative folks who are like, how do people still believe that David Eby is going to be able to change the province? And I'm not a total conservative hack where I respond in that people don't.
Is that going to be your biography? I'm not
now,
a total conservative.
From now on,
I'm
absolutely.
I'm
just
not
a
total
little
NDP
bit.
hack.
But they don't dislike him. Voters don't dislike David Eby as much as they hate viscerally Justin Trudeau. And so when we compare what's happening with this federal blue wave that Pierre Poilievre is riding and created, they think like, oh, naturally we're ready for a change election here in BC too. And then the response being that people may not like David Eby, they may not like his choices, but they don't hate him yet. So again, in my unsolicited advice to the Conservatives, what I think we're going to see are ads from the Conservative side to really poke that issue a little bit more so that people can start to feel a little bit more anger specifically to David Eby in order for John to be seen as a viable alternative.
Let's talk about the economy. Yesterday, BC tabled its first quarter financial update, a $9 billion projected deficit this year, the largest by by $5 billion in BC's history, if we actually hit that, twice the deficit from COVID. The EB government is spending a lot of money to try and tackle the issues we've been talking about here. Voters are going to have to decide whether the money has been well spent and has produced any results. But the economy, the issue of deficit, there was a group of 7 business organizations yesterday that came out, the Chambers of Commerce, the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, the independent businesses, saying these parties in the election need an economic plan. Where is the plan to grow revenue? Where is the plan to bring in skilled workers? Where is the plan, any plan, and put that challenge out to the parties. So deficits, government spending, the economy, economic growth, bringing in workers. We've been talking about social issues as some of the big ones that voters are facing. How big are those issues in the minds of voters right now? And between the 3 parties, where are they on that, Jillian?
I think that part of the economy is still going to take, even though it's, I think that'll still be of interest and concern to people. I think it will still take a backseat to the sort of more immediate cost of living piece of the economy for most people, because that's what most people is top of mind, I think. But I do think that if you are a government that is going to sort of lean into spending because it's an investment in making things better, you need to have a plan for results, both, for the social outcomes, but as well for growth. And I think that that's sort of been the piece that's missing. We kind of got into this situation because everybody was on board with overspending during COVID. It was, pretty intuitive why that was necessary. And that sort of continued, and BC's not unique. You see that kind of everywhere, that the broad public thinking around deficits and the necessity of them right now is pretty consistent in the Western world. But I think that that's kind of the one piece that's missing, especially as it's grown so much, is that there isn't a plan for growth and a plan for sort of the long-term trajectory of it, which creates that sort of uncertainty and that sort of lack of trust, which ends up being the fundamental ballot box question.
And no plan to balance either. When you look at the 3-year fiscal plan from the government, there is no end to deficits in the 3-year fiscal plan, and no plan from the finance minister to end them. Maybe we see it in the campaign, maybe we don't. That's another question that the NDP is wrestling with. If you're spending now for the investments, do you just keep spending, or what are we building in a structural deficit? And those kind of questions dog the government. Jeff?
Well, there's active discussions happening in the campaign about how important is it to signal to the electorate that there's a path back to balance, to get them to listen to your arguments around all of the other things. Because you can say you're going to make everything better on housing and affordability and healthcare and climate, and if folks are just too worried that we're not going to have the economy to be able to raise the money that we need to do those things, it's like they have cotton balls in their ears, and they don't hear the arguments that will get folks to the ballot box. So we'll see if there's a path to balance in the campaign that's not in the fiscal plan right now. Your question is it what role will it play? Will this work? It's really important from a governance and prosperity perspective, but I agree with Jillian that it's going to take a backseat in the campaign to the more immediate bread and butter issues that people are feeling in their day-to-day lives. And it's something that they would hear if they could afford housing, and it's something they would hear if they wouldn't have to wait months to see a specialist. And I'm sounding like the opposition person here now. What's going on? Don't tape this. It's already taping. So I think it's important, and I think it, part of what we're here to talk about is, what are the lessons for tech? What are the things that tech should be doing in this context? And I think you're dealing with parties who right now don't see you as their immediate burning priority, even though underneath it all, it is a huge priority for BC. And having a strong association and being focused on all parts of your engagement with government and having a plan for after the vote to get your elbows up and say, here's how we can help you solve these problems and put our industry back on the right foot, get us on the trajectory you want. 2/3 of you don't think it's there, but you're dealing with an audience that's not listening to you now because they're too focused on voters. But your issues are really important, so after the election, get in their faces and show them how you can help them solve their problems.
Mm-hmm. All of their faces too, because as we've sketched out here,
who knows who's going to win?
Who knows who's going to win, and who knows who's going to hold the balance of power?
The Greens could be the monarch makers. I'm trying to be inclusive.
And, after this election, you could see more shifts. We could come back to some type of new center-right party. We could see an implosion within the BC Conservatives, who are still untested. We could see the wheels fall off the re-elected NDP as they squander their giant majority into a tighter majority. There are so many dynamics that may occur that talking to everyone about your positions, including people who aren't allied to your positions, is key, because they may become your allies in the weird, strange bedfellows of politics. Allie, the economy, BC Tech, advice, all of those issues.
Can I just touch on what you just mentioned of just everybody, including BC United? So I alluded to this earlier, where don't discount BC United, because I have a theory, and this just might be my own little shenanigans in my brain. I have a theory that BC United's going to come back in a big way on the other side of this. One, they didn't dissolve the party. Let's talk about that technical issue. They didn't dissolve the party, they just suspended their campaign. They still have to run 2 candidates in this election in order to maintain some status, and there's some technical reasons as to why and where they might do that. But I have a suspicion that they could give it to one of the incumbents. Who's to say that the party can't go Mike Bernier, Dan Davies, or Tom Shapika, who are all running as independents, will give you back your endorsement of a political machine behind you versus running in as an independent. Therefore,
because you only need how many MLAs for party status?
2. Yeah,
Two.
Yeah. Exactly. And so they're not fully off the table. So if you are doing any sort of work in trying to convince these political parties to do good things and to give them good ideas, the BC United is still very much one of them. And then also these independent candidates. On what's going on with the economy, I want to talk about, one, the deficit. Do people really care about it? We talk about this a lot on the show because we don't really know. I think that in a time of crisis that we had with COVID-19, that we had to spend in order to get us out of it. And therefore, everyone kind of reasonably thought that, okay, the government needs to take care of us. You can go into a deficit. But now we need to build back. And is this government really doing that and has a plan? That's kind of what Jillian was so brilliantly saying. Now, I was at an event yesterday here again, and Gordon Campbell was at the event, and he said that healthcare is always one of those issues, top issues. So when we talk about affordability as potentially one, Leger Polda did something on issues, and so affordability was kind of one, and then healthcare two. Gordon Campbell said that healthcare is always top 3, but the way that we fix it and these policy decisions, that always changes election cycle to election cycle in various political parties. The one thing that I thought was very interesting, kind of squirreled away for the conversation today, tech is always the answer to everything in every ministry. So it's kind of like this magical word. Pierre Poilievre says, tech, not taxes, in order to talk about what's the future of a green climate. And so, that's very interesting on the carbon capture side of things. And then on the healthcare side, I heard a lot of panelists in this conversation yesterday talk about how on a policy front, patients want access to a doctor now. You can't do that without tech. We talk a lot about ER closures in rural parts of this province. And then tech is always that word that comes back of maybe this is the solution.
But you know who doesn't understand tech? Everyone in government. No one in government understands tech, understands the issues. They understand it a little bit in terms of, okay, we need to train people, we need to house people. There's some projects that look promising, we need to get behind them. But there's a real push at the provincial levels for regulation of tech. And you've been seeing it in terms of the online safety tables in British Columbia and all that stuff there. And there's this belief in government that all tech is big, all tech is gigantic. You all have all of the resources available to anyone, lawyers, you can afford to spend on anything. And you can make changes just for BC to your stuff that everywhere else in the world will just say, okay, well, our stuff's used everywhere else in the world. They'll just follow BC. So there's a level of awareness in government, though tech is the solution, they really don't understand all of this stuff for you. And so it's more than just about advocating on your issues. There's got to be some sense of, there's a real opportunity, I think, in terms of partnering with them to grow their expertise and understanding the sector and the impacts of the decisions that they make, and trying to find better ways to work with you to achieve their goals, whether it's safety for kids on the internet or growing the workforce in ways that don't send you to Alberta or to California or out of business because they just don't get it.
Jillian, you want to jump in?
I think one of the things that really surprised me when I went to work in the legislature, I started in politics working on the 2017 campaign, then it was the minority government, and I was in kind of a similar situation from you guys where I came from the outside, and then we were trying to work with government out of our little office to get things done, and it surprised me just how risk-adverse government is and how much hands-on work it required from our staff to actually move things forward. Not just like a couple meetings where someone tells you something's a good idea and they really want to see that happen. It's like you really have to push at every single stage of the process to get things done, and it just takes so much longer and so much more hard work than you think. Even, you know, like I said, when you leave a meeting thinking that you've left it with someone that's going to push it forward, I think that's the thing, because there's just so many pressure points in government where there's someone that can say no, or there's a risk too much, and it's, you know, when they go to a decision maker and they hear that and they say, okay, well, there's a little risk here, it's just so easy for that person to say, okay, we're going to push this to the side and focus on other things. So I think when it comes to actually pushing through anything innovative, just the amount of pressure and continued points that you need to sort of lean into to get things done is
Did you find people that, despite the stasis and the troubles, that there would be every now and then there'd be like a person who got it, and there's a person you could just lean into?
There's like a magic person, but it's so hard to find the person.
But you got to look. You got to look. You got to engage. You got to get out there and meet people and have the conversations, because sometimes you can find.
And things do happen. And that was, I think that was the other thing that surprised me, because I came into politics from like a pretty jaded perspective. I worked in nonprofits and sort of outside of the political arena for a long time, that you actually can get things done, but you have to be really focused on what you want to accomplish, and you just have to keep pushing along the way, not just once or twice, but like 100 times.
In addition to not just the policy makers, I think there's a trend in advocacy campaigns and awareness for people. So politicians, and even you said, at the door. What are people saying at the door? And if there's enough of those people saying your issue at the door, then it'll actually clue in. And those political risks that Jillian was talking about, if you can prove that, no, that we have the numbers, there's this audience of people that believe in this, then they're more inclined to do it, because really the nature of their work is cyclical for every 4 years, right? So they need to make sure that they have a job.
It's a great use of opposition too. I think that's one hallmark of the NDP government. If we do get them again, they're very responsive when something does become a political issue, and having that raised by opposition is a really
Some would say it's the only time.
I think it is. They're very reactive.
Not me. I couldn't possibly say that.
It is something they do well. So,
Happy to take some questions. I hope we gave you kind of an overview of the political landscape as it exists right now. Next week, totally different as it exists right now. But we're happy to sort of chat a bit about anything that's on your mind, or anything that's perplexing you, or anything you want to...
That's great. I might actually just ask you to cover one question that sort of came up to me in advance, which is, and it's a little bit relevant to the BC landscape, you might compare it to other places, but we talk a lot about government, we use the word government. Can we talk a little bit about the Premier's office? The Premier and the Premier's office, and how essential it is for an issue to be championed by them.
Eye of Saruman, the Premier's office. What's it? Everything in this government goes through the Premier's office. This is a government with a very centralized decision-making apparatus from David Eby. We can go around on how you deal with that. It's a government that had, I think, realized along the way it had limited capacity, and it's kind of focusing on its big issues, and other stuff is just not on the table. If you're not on the table, you're not in the discussion, you're not in the Premier's office, stuff's not happening, which is sort of an interesting dynamic right now. And when you look at what might be the dynamic after the election, keep in mind a conservative party that has ballooned out of nowhere, that has no experienced staff, that might take government, is going to be in a complete scramble mode that will disrupt the civil service, disrupt the decision making, disrupt your ability to engage with government, cause chaos for quite a while, and that's another dynamic that could exist after this election too, where you'll be dealing with the fallout of that.
My observation of the Premier's office under John Horgan, it was more delegative to ministers, and so strong ministers especially had more leeway to be able to advance files and solve problems. David Eby takes on a much more hands-on approach, and he's built his office and the structure of his government around that desire. So moving things forward very often requires on the Premier's office to step in, the Premier to say yes, and that's how you get things done. They do listen to ministers, so Brenda Bailey is the minister for your area. She comes from a background of tech, knows these issues. She's a trusted advisor to the Premier and a really good voice to have at the table with you. There are also people in the Premier's office who know tech really well. Their Director of Policy, Megan Sally, I don't know if anyone's ever engaged with her, but she comes from a law and tech background and understands a lot of these issues that we're talking about in a way that the civil service, well-intentioned, work really hard, but just don't know as well, and can help navigate. If you can get her attention, get the Premier's office attention, they can help you navigate things through government. So it's important. There are opportunities for them to help, but it's always going to be a struggle to get their attention, because it's always, as you said, the issues and the loud folks who tend to dominate where the attention goes.
It's like an emergency room. It's just like crises after crises in the Premier's office. Yeah.
The observation that everything's very centralized to the Premier's office, I've been, even like having nothing to do with the NDP and the Premier's office, you can definitely see that if you're putting all of your chips in the NDP basket, there are a couple of things that I would do strategically. And one, I think that David Eby is also building his own team. While he's the leader, I've observed that he has kind of favored certain candidates across the province, and those are his people, because these are the people that he's going to recruit for his team. And so the candidate for Little Mountain, for example, is one that comes to mind. And so if you're putting all your chips in the NDP basket, the people who are hand-selected by David Eby in one way or another.
That was a nomination. Yeah. That was an actual nomination battle there. I know his wife endorsed that candidate that won.
I'm not saying that it had anything to do with her winning the nomination, but she's very close with David Eby, right. And so yes, there is that connection. And so if there's at all a way that you can build that connection with them, then that's going to be the person who's talking to David Eby quite significantly over the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the usual stew of how you get things through government. You have a problem, you need to present a solution. Don't just go with a problem and say, I don't know what to do about this. You need a solution. You need to be willing to stand with the government to help be a stakeholder and an advocate for it. And you need, as Jeff's pointed out, you need an ally in either the ministerial table or the Premier's office or the tip of the political iceberg who can push it forward. Because I've observed with this Premier, he doesn't particularly trust the civil service very much, and you may get some traction within the mid-level of the bureaucracy, only to discover that never makes its way anywhere. He distrusted the civil service in his time as Attorney General. He has special advisors in his office whose sole job are to just ride the civil service like a chariot, just to move it along in the way he wants. And so you have to have a different dynamic when you engage government. It has to be more than just the executive director of this program area thinks this is a good idea or whatever, which is more to what Jeff was saying.
Here's how a meeting with David Eby will go if you get the meeting with David Eby. You will have met with the ministry officials. They will have built the brief. They would have briefed him on the issue. He would have read it in detail. He will say, hey, why don't you tell me what this is all about? He doesn't really want to hear what it's all about because he already knows what it's all about because he's read the brief. But he wants to see what you're going to say for a couple of minutes, and then he'll stop and ask you the 2 or 3 things that are really on his mind about what's happening. He won't meet with you if you're just coming to talk about a problem unless it's a really serious, awful, terrible problem. You'll want to talk about a solution, and the conversation will be about why should I do this? What's in it for BC? What's in it for the government? What are the benefits? And can you answer my 3 hang-ups about it? And if you get through that, the meeting will be about 10 minutes long, and then you'll be on your way. If it goes well. If not, keep trying.
And Jillian, in other parties too, like, what's the best sort of advocacy when you're dealing with MLAs or folks who are you're just sort of engaging with them?
I think, again, it's that like repeated nature of it, because the MLAs are so busy and they meet with so many people, and they're so, they're generally pretty personable. They want to say yes. And so I think just continuing to move things along and kind of being in their ear, and also following up with staff. Like the MLAs have so much. They're sort of like the downstream of everything, especially when they're in the House. But making sure that you make those relationships at the staff level and that you keep kind of moving things along consistently is sort of, I think, the best way to get things done if you're hoping to get stuff out of the other parties.
Do you folks get in your YouTube stream, or maybe that's just what old people watch, I don't know, but I watch it, the videos of the guy who's trying to sell cars, and he's advising people on the selling of cars, and
That's just you.
Just me. Anyways, his whole shtick is every step of the way is just getting people to say yes, 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 until they finally get what you want. And that's what government relations is. Find ways to get people to say yes all along the way in little ways until you get to yes, and you have to be persistent, like you say.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll just quickly check in with my audience. Is there anyone who wants to raise a question now in the public forum? I hope many of you will stay and have a chat with the panelists. Yes, we've got a couple. Do you want to, Rich, should we come to you first?
Sure, thanks. So I recognize politics, probably like society in general, it's a series of echo chambers. You're kind of surrounded by people that agree with you, whether it's social media or in person. So I recognizing that bias. One of the themes that seems to be consistent across different demographics, at least that I talk to, is, I'll call it just a confusion as to why there is not a political party, either federally, provincially, that is fiscally conservative but socially sort of centered, and that doesn't have crazy conspiracy theories, but that is sort of more run-of-the-mill across all of the major issues, but recognize the importance of investment, recognize the importance of balanced budgets, right? All the things that I think the business community is railing against for the current government. So what are your thoughts on that? And maybe to put a finer point on it, there is a party just emerging, it's got all the startup issues that you'd expect, called the Future BC, Canadian Future Party. Started on these, but thoughts on that from each of you?
Allie, do you want to? The only thing that would come to mind would be, we did have that for a long time under the BC Liberals, and it was a agreement that the social conservatives in this coalition would by and large shut up, and that you wouldn't talk about contentious issues, social issues, and you would rally behind the fiscal conservatism and keep the social issues sort of moderate. And the rise in the United States of social extremism, and in other provinces and even federally, that agreement to sort of be part of a winning team and shut up on some of your values doesn't exist anymore. You can go out and strike it out on your own, and other countries and other provinces have shown you can be successful in that. So it's harder. Kevin Falcon sort of tried a little bit and failed. It's hard to stitch that group together when one side feels like it can go off and do it on its own, and what does it need to be here for? But that was just my thoughts.
That was exactly it, is that we did have that under the BC Liberals, and Kevin kind of blew that up for this election cycle as an option. Going way back, there were some issues with the BC Liberals that again, they were a coalition of federal Liberals and federal Conservatives, and those federal Liberals were moving away to the NDP because Jeff was doing such a good job. And then the Conservatives were becoming a little bit more polarized into the right side of the political spectrum because of that blue wave from Pierre Poilievre. Now, there is no clear option for that this time around, but like I said, BC United may still continue to exist for the next cycle, there is some room for the BC Conservatives to be that. Granted, a lot of their introduction to politics has been more on the social issues and less on the financial issues, but I think we're going to see some endorsements that will be key from like business community types, and that'll be the trend of where does the business community put their trust with the NDP or with the Conservatives. My gut is that we're going to see some endorsements more on the fiscal conservative side to the Conservatives. So there's potential with the.
It sounds like you're planning something.
I know nothing.
You don't know anything.
No, I know nothing. But when you announce that we're billions more in debt, there's a clear, obvious choice as to who the fiscal conservatism endorsement goes to. So I hope I'm right. I hope there's some endorsements. I think that the Conservatives really need it because they need some legitimacy. So it's unfair that there's really not that clear choice. But if you're just voting on economic issues, then I think there needs to be more of those policy conversations from each of the parties. But unfortunately, at least for like the last 2 weeks, we've been kind of stuck in the political drama, less the policy.
I think where the political debate will happen in the campaign and what you'll hear from the Premier is we're paying the price for wrong choices made before that led to the problems that we have now, and we have to dig out from underneath them, and that's why we're where we're at. But that we'll see where that goes. That's not the question. The question is, why can't you have a fiscally conservative, socially progressive government? And we've talked about a lot of the reasons. One thing that we haven't talked about is who are the activists in political parties. And the people who are activists in political parties who feel very strongly about policy and issues and are on the scale of, they tend to be folks who will polarize more than other folks in, I have to get my kid to school. I have to make it to work on time. Did the lunches get made? Did I remember to pay that bill? Can I afford to go out for dinner? Those folks who are like living that busy life are less inclined to be in political parties than someone who thinks that capitalism is bad, or that I could name off all. I don't want to be mean to conservatives. That would be. Go ahead, do it. That we should have real clear positions on restricting women's rights to reproductive health decisions. So there's the forces inside the party pulling them to the extremes, and the folks in the center who make up the bulk of people in the community aren't as well represented, and so you see the parties go off in those directions.
That's been the success, though, of municipally when ABC was created. They kind of went for that socially progressive and fiscally conservative, and we are seeing that unfold right now, but I think that's why they won, and it's such a sweep.
I think the other thing I'd add to that is there's never been a harder time to get people to run for office and to work in politics on the staff side than there is now. So that's why you see people with more extreme beliefs, because they feel so fired up about whatever kind of niche issue that's getting them motivated to run. It's a lot of work, especially because you do all this work without knowing if you're ever going to get paid for it if you're just running. So I think it's the parties are all struggling with recruitment. That was one of the things that was dogging BC United, and I'm sure one of the reasons why.
Why don't you ask the room here? Who here would consider running for office? Knowing what we know
about
the way the world is.
And it is hard to you hear that from the leaders.
See no hands.
Yeah. The math would I think it's easy if you've come to BC in the last little while to believe, and many New Democrats who've arrived here believe, that this is a wonderful socialist province. And it's worth just reminding that the New Democrats have only won 5 out of 78 elections in the history of British Columbia, right? 5.
Well, 5 is right, but 78 is
probably. 5 elections. And the math suggests that if you have a united opposition to the NDP, that you can win. And when the united opposition fractures into that social or fiscal conservatism and progressive, and it fractures, then the votes split off and the NDP walks to victory. And so you see this trend again and again of the center-right fracturing and then coming back together to win. and then winning for a while and then getting really tired and fighting amongst themselves and then fracturing and then coming back together. And that's sort of where we think we might be at right now, is the Conservatives are either going to win this election or not, and there will be a coalescence of a new movement to incorporate that vision that you said, that will then continue to win conceivably a whole bunch more elections in BC, maybe, depending on if you believe that that's the history of our province, which the math would suggest it is, but yeah.
Okay. Cam, you had a question.
Yeah, Allie, you mentioned the time machine. I remember when I was graduating university a million years ago, feels like, remember when Gordon Campbell first ran, it said 96, 97, somewhere around there? Almost won, and then swept following election. It feels like, I remember the sense of apathy, sort of dissatisfaction in general. In the sort of, there's an angst right now that I don't know if I can put my finger on, like, why is everyone so pissed off across the spectrum? And it feels like, I remember that I moved to the UK, I was like, okay, there's no opportunities here, time to go somewhere else. And then you had this sort of sea change in politics. And I remember, because he didn't run as a Socrates, he ran as a BC Liberal. I don't know if the similarities between the Conservatives now and not wanting to be the Liberals, not have that baggage, but do you see any similarities between what you saw 25 years ago, or whatever it was, to now? Because across the tech sector, like, I don't know anyone who's happy. I spent a lot of time in Alberta. There's a lot of optimism there. I remember that optimism feel here in the ecosystem. It's not now. People are pissed. And I couldn't tell you why, other than they can't afford to live here. And everything seems to get worse. Not to be a downer, but that's just the vibe. I talked to a lot of founders. And it doesn't take long to scratch below the surface. I heard the $9 billion number yesterday. Like, in my car, I was thinking, I'm guessing what the number would be. I think like 2.9. It's just outrageous. And so it feels like there's the sort of all the conditions for something quite monumental to change. But you're also inside. I'm curious if it feels like that inside, or just observing it.
That numb feeling, I think, is one that I think now we've just kind of accepted it, because everything's kind of been thrown at us. And, we say $9 billion, and the fact that there was an outrage in downtown Vancouver, like 25 years ago, but yeah, you probably would get a big protest. And now we're just like, oh yeah, it's Monday, like that's cool. Thanks, Jeff.
It's Wednesday.
And sorry, but the similarity from then to now is when Kevin Falcon was making his decision that kind of blew up BC politics. He kept saying that this was a decision to unite voters so that we could defeat the NDP, and that's essentially what happened all those years ago. Was that they got together in order for socialism to not win in BC, and so that's it. Now, it wasn't the same, and now we have these independent candidates that might split the vote, and so it won't be the same playbook whatsoever, and that's just the reality of BC politics, is we kind of never like to do the same thing twice.
But it certainly feels to me, and I said this on the podcast 2 years ago, and I know you all listen religiously to our niche political podcast, but I said that even as Falcon was becoming leader, that it felt like that change from BC social credit to BC Liberals, and this election feels exactly like that. It was an old version that was past its before date. They're moving on to something new. I think there are absolutely the conditions for a change of government in British Columbia, but there are also powerful forces that constrain the growth of BC Liberals in that first election around new party, ready to govern. We're not sure yet. So I feel it's going to be close. I don't know who's going to win, but the big hurdle that the Conservatives are going to have to face is people's disquiet over whether they're ready to lead a province. Next election is a real credible scenario as they grow a really strong opposition base in this election, and that creates the foundation for a win the next time.
The only sneaky vote audience in all of this, which I will find out on October 20th if I'm right, are brand new voters, these young voters, because they're the ones who can't afford a house and who have been dealt with all of these issues. And when we talk about that numbness, like, they never got the prosperity era. So like, they've always just been in a rut. And so my suspicion is that if any political party can really get out that vote that has never voted before, so this is like the 20 to 30-year-old, specifically young men, and I say this because this was the group that came out for Pierre Poilievre for leadership, and that's why he was so massively successful. Now, if they come out to vote, I think it won't necessarily matter what the history of any political party was or any sort of record, because for the most part, people are just kind of doing their own thing. But they might see a little optimism in this new political party with the Conservatives.
If they succeed, could you get them to come to my house and talk to my 16-year-old boy and get him to do some chores? Because I can't get him to do anything. But if they can get them to get up and vote, they could monetize that and help me with parenting.
Well, somebody asked me the other day, what's the audience that the Conservatives, both provincially and federally, are going after? And I can't necessarily answer that question because I don't know. But my suspicion is that based on Pierre Poilievre's tour is that these are workers. These are people who are actually going to work 9 to 5 in their hard hats. And still, even with a good paying salary, it's not enough. And if we can mobilize that vote, that might change things. Then we can get your son a job.
Question over there.
Great. Yes, I rip off of this. Sure. The other day, I was in Thrifty Foods, and the young lady who was doing my cashiering, brought up politics, and it was so funny. And I said, "Oh, are you going to vote?" And she was like, "Oh, no, I'm not involved." But I do follow the U.S., the Kamala Harris. I follow that, and she was so much more engaged in the U.S. Politics. Maybe it's because of the sensationalism of it. But the one thing she said is, the only thing I know about politics is that there's somebody who's trying to ban birth control. And she was probably 19 years old. And I found it so interesting that you bring this topic up, because I think it is such a missed opportunity, and I'm interested to see. And if you guys have any inside, word on that, what are they doing to mobilize the younger generation, to get them to get out of the apathy, get them to prepare? Like, there's a lot of the subjects that are on the table right now, Jeff, that you mentioned, that hit them really close to the heart. So how is this being leveraged to get more people involved?
I think different parties are doing different things. I think Conservatives are looking at more the young men vote. I think the NDP is looking more at the young women vote, and you've touched on one issue where they're targeting. If you look at the vote splits, the NDP is like 20 points ahead of the Conservatives amongst women, but it's behind on men. I think where American politics is better, and that's a real stretch because it's really awful right now, but they're very good at, in a way that British Columbia politicians are not, about speaking to the bigger ideals of what they believe in and the vision of what they want to build. Everything here feels very transactional in terms of, this election is about making healthcare better, as opposed to what kind of province do we want to build, or it's about, we want to get rid of the carbon tax, and as opposed to what kind of. So I think all the parties will do it differently. I think they would be more effective at engaging folks like that cashier if they spoke more persuasively to people's bigger aspirations and dreams and debated on that level, rather than, we're going to introduce choice to ICBC to reduce rates for drivers, versus I brought the premiums down.
And the U.S. politics is such a cultural moment, there's that fear of missing out, the urge to participate online in this moment of last night's debate where you got to watch it in case something happens so you can talk about it and all your friends are tweeting about it. We don't have that in BC. There's not that level of engagement, and for better or for worse, I guess. We will have a debate, televised debate during the election. Be interesting to see how many people watch it. How many people even have cable to watch it?
The 16-year-old watched it last night.
Your 16-year-old?
Yeah, my 16-year-old. I don't know if he's going to watch the BC one. I might force him, but it won't be his choice.
Yeah, but the Greens, Jillian, they often have a different message that is larger as Jeff was talking about what kind of province. They swing big, free public transit, 4-day work weeks. They have a much more aspirational message to try and appeal to some of those voters, even if the prospect of them winning and forming government is zero, because they're not going to run enough candidates probably to do it. But they do tap into that a little bit to try and get voters to come out for a hope message rather than a fear message.
Yeah, I think it's easier when you have a smaller party to sometimes have like more of an like almost authentic message, because it becomes a lot more driven by who the leader in that case feels comfortable being. Whereas with the bigger parties, you tend to get ads and messages that are so overly focus grouped and message tested that they sound really inauthentic. And I think it's interesting thinking about Eby. I think he's so much better when he's just himself, and it'll be so. I think it's one of the things I'm most interested about the campaign is just how much he leans into that and how much his team kind of gives him space for that. And because that's really what comes through. Like when you look at elections where young people did turn out, which there's not a lot of them. It was like the first one for Trudeau or Obama. It really was that really simple, strong, emotional quality of hope that gets younger people out. Because the Greens, they also try to target younger voters. It's really, really hard to do it through any of the other tactics that we use to target other demographics. It really has to be sort of that groundswell of that feeling that's really difficult to cultivate when you've got a big campaign with a lot of people that are inside the bubble, kind of workshopping things to death. So,
and I don't think, I could be wrong here, but is there a party that has proposed getting rid of free birth control? Like that message that young cashier got.
John Rustad. Okay, so here I'm not selling something here. I'm just telling you what I think is happening. So when the NDP announced free birth control, John Rustad's initial reaction was, "That's nuts." Mm-hmm. He said, "That's nuts. We shouldn't be paying for that." Right. So now they're saying because he said that then, that if he becomes premier, he will stop paying for it.
But yesterday
he said, "I'll never happen."
He said nothing will change on access to abortion, prescription birth control, and contraceptives, Plan B. So,
except that he thinks it's nuts. Except that he thinks that it's nuts is what the NDP would say.
But the idea that 19-year-old cashier, that sub-message, which may or may not even be accurate, infiltrated her life to the point that was the one thing she was talking about.
That sounds very nefarious. Infiltrated.
I did see social media ads for them. That's the first. Yeah.
And that's part of the, I don't want to say American-style culture wars, but that'll be part of this election. Will be John Rustad says nothing is going to change. The NDP says, "Well, I might take away your," and who do you believe, and how does that message land, and are you afraid? Like fear is the great motivator, unfortunately.
If your starting point is a sense of an identity of conservatives from watching the States, that is the sort of thing that they believe, that's kind of the trigger in the brain that gets triggered, and it takes a lot to change people's minds. And it's usually not no, that's not true. It's got to be something big and emotive and that will affect people to make them change their mind. In the same way that it would do that on the NDP side, like they'll balance a budget. Like they did it 5 out of 7 times until this one, but people are going to say, "Oh my God, they've got a $9 billion deficit. They don't know what they're doing." And it takes a lot to change that. It's just how your brains think.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming. I want to be a bit respectful of your time. Make sure you can get to your next commitment. But if you can stay, please do stay, because I think we could close the formal part of the agenda but continue the informal conversation, especially about the interaction of provincial and federal politics, what might be happening on the federal scene. Maybe we'll see change or an election sooner than a year from now. There's lots to talk about, and we'd really love to have a collaborative conversation with you over lunch if you're free to stay.